Welcome to Military Justice and the Law, presented to you by Bulelani Tseu. In this episode, I'll be discussing history that is relevant to the administration of military justice in South Africa. This history is too vast. Therefore, I will not be doing justice to it if I attempt to cover everything in one episode. So this episode basically is limited to a period 1811 until 1910. Some may agree with the statement that for one to know where he's going, he must have an appreciation of where he's at presently. And such a person must take history into consideration. In my view, examining South Africa's military justice system requires that approach. Generally, military law can be traced in Roman law or is rooted in Roman law. However, South Africa's military justice system finds its roots in British military law. And for this reason, my focus will not be on the Romans or Roman law. After all, the Romans didn't come to South Africa to do all manner of things, but the British did. During the later years of the 18th century, the British came to South Africa with the purpose of annexing the land in order to expand the British Empire. When the British arrived in South Africa, there were people here, the natives were here, the Khoisan people, Xhosas, Zulus, Sotos, among others were here. Also, there was also a white community that resided in certain parts of the country. And that community is known as the Afrikaners or the Boers. So because of these sinister motives of the British, clashes were bound to come about between the British and the natives, as well as between the British and the Afrikaners. One such engagement took place in 1811 when the British fought against the Xhosas in one of the Cape Frontier Wars with the aim of annexing the land that was occupied by the Xhosas. Importantly, when the British fought the wars against the natives and Afrikaners, they used the British military soldiers who came with gunpowder, fighting against people who used spears, bows, arrows, and assegai. So the British soldiers were technologically advanced than the natives. And this is therefore the reason why the British soldiers prevailed in most wars that they fought against the natives. I must therefore hasten then to mention that there were also other wars that the British soldiers lost against the natives. A case in point is the Battle of Isandlwane, where the British fought against the Zulus in 1879. So importantly here is that when the British fought the wars, the soldiers had to adhere to the highest standard of discipline. And the discipline of the British soldiers was regulated in accordance with the Articles of War and the Mutiny Acts. And that was before 1881, of course. I'll return to the events of 1881 going forward later on. So the Mutiny Acts and the Articles of War contained offenses as well as punishment that could be imposed on British soldiers. And most of the sentences that were contained therein were very severe, in the sense that soldiers could be sentenced to death for deserting from the army or for assisting somebody to desert. So was also punishable by death. There were also other punishments, known as flogging and branding. Those were severe and brutal punishment. So essentially then, British soldiers knew that, they had to adhere to this high standard of discipline, lest they find themselves, being exposed to such punishments that the military tribunals could impose. Military tribunals at the time were courts-martial as well as the summary trials. So, fast forward then, the British did not only fight against the natives, as I've already mentioned. Clashes arose between the British soldiers and the Afrikaners. In 1880, in December, the Afrikaners and the British soldiers fought in what is referred to as the First Anglo-Boer War. And the Afrikaners won that war, culminating to the signing of a treaty known as the Pretoria Convention, where it was agreed that the Afrikaners will keep the Transvaal and they'll govern themselves there. And that treaty was signed in 1881. So essentially, the First Anglo-Boer War lasted for a period of 3 months. That peace treaty didn't last long because 18 years later, war broke between the Afrikaners and the British. And that war in 1899, was to be referred to as the Second Anglo-Boer War, and it lasted for 3 years because it ended in 1902 with the signing of the Vereeniging Treaty on the 31st of May, 1902. The arrangement that came about the Vereeniging Treaty was that the Afrikaners will govern themselves in the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, but will still be subjected, to the rule of the British. So it was just a minor independence in a way, minor freedom, if I can put it like that. So, importantly, Africans, the natives, were not part of those arrangements. So, the British soldiers remained in South Africa because South Africa was colonized, at the time. It was part of a British colony. This is therefore the reason why in 1909, British Parliament enacted what is now what is referred to as the South Africa Act of 1909. The rationale behind enacting that legislation was to establish a Union of South Africa, where Orange Free State, Natal, Transvaal, and the Cape Colony were to be amalgamated to form the Union of South Africa. That is basically what happened at that particular time. So British soldiers, provided protection even to Transvaal and the Orange Free State, although at the time those two areas were regarded as the Boer republics, but there were still some remnants of the British military in those areas. So essentially, as I've already said, that I will return to the events that took place after 1881. In 1881, offenses and punishment that were contained in the Mutiny Acts, as well as that Articles of War were consolidated to form part of the British Army Act of 1881. So when then the Second Anglo-Boer War broke, the conduct of the soldiers was regulated in accordance with the provisions of the British Army Act of 1881, which in the main also created, the courts martial to try soldiers for various offenses. And that happened because some soldiers who were fighting for the empire, had to be sentenced to death. Case in point, one can think of, off the cuff, is your Harry Morant. He was basically executed by a firing squad. So punishment in that era was very severe. So basically, in this episode, I wanted to highlight that the history of South Africa's military justice system finds its roots in British military law, because it is British military law that was transplanted to South Africa. That is why we saw the application of those instruments when the British, fought against the natives, as well as when the British soldiers fought against the Afrikaners. So essentially, we've covered that part, and going forward now, we will look at the developments after the unionization of South Africa, which took place on the 31st of May 1910. So the upcoming episode will cover the events from 1910 up until 1948. The chosen period will be clear as to why from 1910 to 1948, when we get there. So up until then, I trust that you've enjoyed the episode, and I must thank you for paying attention. Please, man, whoever hasn't subscribed as yet, please press the subscribe button. Thank you. Take care. Bye.